The lights came on just about 2 seconds before I thought they would. Good to see you, Victorville. Good to see me. All right, thank you. Just need a little encouragement once in a while. If you need a copy of the outline, raise your hand. Regardless of where you might be sitting today, we have a free holiday copy of the notes for you. And by the way, thank the Lord for Thanksgiving, because we get to eat more than we should and hang around with family, maybe a little more than we normally do. So if I forget to tell you later in the service, and I probably will because I'm 62 now, happy Thanksgiving. Cheryl and I are blessed to share life with you all and hope that you'll have a great holiday. Okay, want to welcome everybody, not just you here in Victorville, but also in Apple Valley and Hesperia and Phelan, our entire church family coming together this part of the service each weekend to consider the Word of God. Matthew chapter 13, if you have your Bibles, you can show up there. We won't be there for a couple of minutes, but we will eventually find our way there and talk about another parable. Parables, that's been our theme for the last little while now, last couple of months. We've tried to elevate some of the parables that you might not be quite as familiar with as you have your favorites. And there have been certain parables that Jesus gave that have ascended to the top of the charts. You know, top 5 parables that Jesus gave out of his 40 that get a lot of airtime. And we've tried to give you some that might not be quite as familiar, but equally as important as Spirit of God has preserved them for us in the Bible. Today we'll be looking at one that you may have heard of, but probably not, so that's good. Glad you're here. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. That's a very general way to describe a parable. Jesus would use this methodology often. In fact, he was unique in his generation for doing so. Most of the teachers of his day did not utilize this particular methodology in their teaching, but Jesus thought it would be a good idea to just throw a story out there that everybody in the audience would connect to, and then give it a meaning that went beyond what we might consider in our earthly lives, give it a heavenly meaning. And so you'll hear him say at the beginning of many, not all of them, but many, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like and then he would tell a story. So what we learn from the parables is how King Jesus evaluates his kingdom, how he runs his kingdom, what the kingdom of heaven is like. And we feel tension in all of these stories. That's why we craft the music leading into the message each weekend during the series the way we do. It's probably the most difficult music I have ever listened to in my entire life. It just gets me all tensed up when I hear it, but that's the point. It's strategic because these stories are not easy to listen to, especially if you're in the audience, the original audience, and there were very direct implications for those that he was teaching, and we are in his audience, so I guess those implications are as direct for us, especially this parable. This tension that we feel in this parable is the tension that we all feel every day. We've entitled the presentation, The Tension Between Church and Culture. And we find ourselves, it seems at least, we find ourselves living in the middle of a boxing ring. Do you ever feel that way? Like there are two heavyweights duking it out and we're just trying to, stay out of it because it's ugly. But what they're doing is they're fighting for the heart of our culture. And when I say heavyweights, I'm not talking about Donald and Hillary. I'm not talking about CNN and Fox News. In fact, these days when elections are won, you can't even declare victory because there's still such divisiveness, such resentment that continue. And it's not just the ever-increasing political divide between the right and the left. Even within those camps, there continues to be that same divisiveness and rancor and resentment, now blaming your own teammates, either for why things didn't go as planned or for not going as well as they should be going. In fact, in retrospect, we've just had to endure one of the most difficult seasons of our history, at least in the last 62 years of our history. But I look at the list of election issues. In fact, the top 10 domestic issues in order of America's concern about each one. Just look at the list. The economy, national security, healthcare, guns, immigration, social security, education, Supreme Court, race relations, abortion. Now, this is pre-election. And if you're number 1 or 2 or 3 kind of languish here toward the bottom, don't feel too badly, because the statistical separation between our concern for these and our concern for those is pretty slim. But they're all important discussions to have, but they're not just important, they're divisive. Each one frames for us a different theater of war in our culture. And then you throw all 10 of these in the same election? You throw all 10 in the same conversation? Oh man, you start to understand why we are where we are as a people. We're divided, resentful, suspicious, fearful, and at times even explosively angry. But it's important to remember that below the surface of all of this, there is something that's stirring the pot. There's something that agitates each of these narratives. Something that our culture doesn't respect. Something that our society doesn't understand. But Jesus understands. And he's going to tell us a little bit about it today. I'm a history fan, maybe. I always loved history in school. I wasn't a history major at any level of my education, but nevertheless, I find myself reading often books of history or reflecting elements of our history, especially American history. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian shot an Austrian. And within 6 weeks, most of Europe had become involved in a war that would eventually lead to the deaths of 10 million soldiers. On June 28th of that year, one man was shot. But there was a lot brewing underneath the surface. And if you don't understand what led to World War I, you will misinterpret that event in and of itself. Let me tell you what's brewing. As Paul writes the Ephesian church in chapter 6, verse 12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Oh, you thought this was our struggle. Oh, that explains a lot, man. Y'all thought that was the problem. Or those were the problems. Oh, no. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. There is a spiritual war going on that we get caught up in, and we need to respect it so that we can understand all the rest. A guy named Stu Weber, in reflecting on his introduction to the Vietnam War, I'm just going to read a little bit from what he wrote a few years back. He said, on a lonely midwinter day, I and a couple hundred other soldiers took a flight across the ocean. Boarding that commercial airliner, we stowed our gear and fastened our seatbelts just as we had so many times before. It all seems so routine. But the next time they opened that door, routine vanished like a dream. Heat and humidity rolled over us like a tsunami. Every pore in our bodies seeped sweat. And the smell, a strange brew of jet fuel, sewage, rotting vegetables, and smoke. This was Vietnam. It looked like the depiction of a war zone that you might have seen in the movies, but this was not a movie. There was no marching band, no cigar-chomping John Wayne to welcome us. Just a single, somewhat tired GI pointing to a line of waiting buses, engines running. His message was simple. Welcome to the war. Explaining today's parable really isn't that difficult. In fact, after you read it, you'd probably guess what the meaning is. But the good news is we don't have to guess, because Jesus, in this parable, unlike many, actually identifies each component to the parable and gives us his explanation. And when we read it, he essentially is saying, welcome to the war. And he paints a picture, not just of what we're experiencing today, but what we should expect, not only today, but throughout the course of the church age. In fact, he's going to give his followers right here, he's going to give his followers, we look at this timeline, he's going to give his followers things that they should expect throughout the church age. Now, the church age is a term that refers to a period of time that began when Jesus was born. And the church began its mission. He was born, he lived a perfect life, he died on the cross to pay in full for all of humanity's sin, and then he conquered our greatest enemy, death, by resurrecting from the grave. He issued the Great Commission to the believers that had come to place their faith in him while he was alive, and he told them to go out and change the world, to take the good news of the cross to every corner of the planet. And that began the church. That began the church age, and it will conclude when he comes back. In fact, the church age has boundaries between the advents of Jesus, his first coming and his second coming. And we are living now somewhere by the question mark, not really sure how close we are leaning into that great day yet future when Jesus will return for us all. But of course, when Jesus gave this parable, he delivered it to those who would anticipate this season of time. Verse 24, chapter 13, Jesus told them another parable. He said, the kingdom of heaven, there we go. Here we go. The kingdom of heaven is like this guy who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. And then he went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. So he starts out by telling the story that everybody in the room would get, because they were either farmers or very connected to others in their family who were. And they knew the problem of weeds. Not that we have that problem in the high desert. Weeds will always be an issue for you, especially when you're trying to plant something. I remember when I first planted my first lawn years ago, and I was bound and determined to beat the desert, right? And so I was working, and a guy came walking by my front yard, and he said, you know, that's a nice lawn you're putting in there. Did you know, he said, that grass is the second most effective weed deterrent there is? I said, the second? What's the first? He said, concrete. Man, we all know the battle between what we want to grow and the weeds that want to grow and give us problems. So here's an observation. We should expect the church to remain focused on a worldwide harvest while the world itself becomes increasingly engulfed by a worldwide evil. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but it really is the clash of kingdoms. Jesus is building his church, and at the same time, evil is continuing to embed itself in our culture. Now, you might think at face value that those two things are mutually exclusive concepts, But Jesus says you can expect both to flourish, both the church and evil, both the harvest and the weeds. Just like the fig, not that you're fig experts, or I expect you to be, but we did give a parable on the fig tree earlier in the series. And so to some degree, you are experts with figs. And now I want to help you become an expert on wheat. Wheat was also, like the fig, an incredibly important crop in Palestine. It was grown everywhere. And there was a weed, a particular weed, that the wheat farmers loathed. Now we call it the bearded darnel. I trimmed my beard this last week just so I was not confused and you would not start calling me that. The bearded darnel. It's a poisonous ryegrass. And for the first part of its development, when it would just begin to sprout, it looked just like wheat. You couldn't tell the difference. In fact, in some places today, the bearded darnel is actually still referred to as false wheat. But as soon as the grain begins to form a head, the difference between wheat and the bearded darnel becomes obvious. Now, this is what we've told you many times in different ways, but we can look at it again in this story. Time eventually vets everyone. Life will eventually present a circumstance that will expose people for who they really are. For these weeds, it was just a matter of time. At the beginning of the growth cycle, it seemed as if they might be wheat, because time had not worked its magic yet. If you remember the story, it's a better known story, better known parable Jesus shared about the wise builder and the foolish builder. Do you remember in Matthew 7? It was in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus was talking about two builders, and both of them looked pretty competent. But that was before the winds began to blow. That was before the storms came. You see, what people who were driving by their houses, they each built a house, and as people were driving by their houses, they couldn't see something. And it's what they couldn't see that made the difference. You see, when you drive around your community, you see the superstructure, you don't see the foundation. You have no idea what's down there. But it's the foundation that actually determines the outcome for each house and each builder in lieu of the storm. And it was just a matter of time before, by the way, the exact same storm hit both houses, because we all go through the same things in life. Different times, different ways, different levels. But what you're going through right now, others have gone through before or will in the future. We all face the same issues. We all face the same storms. And those storms expose us, expose the foundations of our life for what they really are. It's essentially the same principle Jesus is sharing in this parable. See, by the time the farmer is able to discern between the wheat and the bearded darnel, both had grown so close together, both's roots had intertwined so closely that removing the weed would compromise the value of the wheat. And since you're a farmer who wants to make a living, you want to make sure you separate them at the right time. And what Jesus said is that separation is not going to occur until the end of the harvest season. Verse 27, the owner's servants came to him and they said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull the weeds up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Okay, here's another observation, so fill in a blank or two. While Christ Church remains focused on a worldwide harvest, and while the world itself becomes increasingly engulfed by this worldwide evil, here's something else we should expect. We should expect the church to thrive in the midst of this growing threat. The church will thrive. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the church is thriving. And I know you get tired and you You've got your focus, by the way, on the wrong things. You're looking at the threat, and you're not watching what Jesus is doing in his church. Nothing can stop the momentum of the Christian movement. Nothing. No one. No government can. No political machine can. No legislation can. Nothing can. Nobody gets to do that except the head of the church. And as you saw on our chart, he has not yet returned to do so. And until that time, his church will thrive. One of the greatest examples that I love to refer back to is the Christian church in China. Because back in 1949, there were about 500,000 Christians in China. That was when the media was shut down. The Chinese government claimed to have shut down the church, but once again, that's above everybody's pay grade. And so when the lights went back on, several decades later, that 500,000 number had increased dramatically. Some estimates were as high as 130 million Christians. And you might remember that during the years that China went dark in terms of the world's ability to see in and to see what was taking place spiritually, during all of those years, weekend services like this one that we're enjoying right now, they were not allowed. Can you imagine how Jesus was ever going to build his church without a weekend service in a big building? The reason he could do that is because church has never been a place you go to. It's been a group of people. And we come into this building as a group of people. When we're gone, this is not a church. This is a building. And when we're here, it's still a building where the church is meeting. You don't go to church, you are the church. Jesus never told the world to come into a building. He told the church to get themselves out of the building, go into the world and make a difference. And bring the good news of the gospel to the people he has supernaturally and strategically placed us around every day. And that's the cool thing. You don't even have to go because you're already platformed in this community. You are everywhere. Jesus has always built his church through relationships. Relationships that develop between believers and non-believers every day of the week. And throughout history, that is why the church has thrived. Talk about thrive during the greatest seasons of Christian oppression. In fact, I was reflecting this past week and pulling out some of those history books again, just to read a little bit about the reigns of some of the most brutal Roman Caesars, of that line of emperors. And it was during some of those most oppressive, persecutive seasons of Christian history that the church thrived the most. The church virtually took over the ancient world while it was under the heavy hand of Rome. It took 1,900 years for evangelical Christianity to grow from 0% of the world's population to 2.5% of the world's population. And then it took 70 years to go from 2.5% to 5%. And it took just 22 years to go from 5% to 10%. The church is not just thriving, my friends, it's picking up steam. It's estimated there were about 200 million people in the world when Jesus was alive. That's global residents. And the Bible tells us that the Great Commission was given to a group of 120. 120 believers who came to place their faith in Christ during his earthly ministry. They were in the upper room that night before Pentecost. Acts chapter 1 verse 15 is very specific. 120 were there. And that means that there was fewer than one Christian for every 1,667,000 non-Christians on planet Earth. And when you understand that 95% of people who give their hearts to Christ because of a relationship they have with someone in their oikos, those 8 to 15 people God has supernaturally and strategically brought into your sphere of influence. when you look at those metrics, you recognize that since there's one Christian for every almost 1.7 million people, and you understand that God changes the world 8 to 15 people at a time, you know this is going to take a while, man. And now you fast forward 2,000 years. The 200 million global residents who are alive in Jesus' day have increased to over 7 billion. That is, there are 35 times more people alive today than there were in the first century. And yet there is now one evangelical believer for every 9 non-believers. 9 or 12, depending on what research you want to believe. 9 on the low side, 12 on the high side. While the number of people in the world has doubled 5 times, the ratio of believer to non-believer has been cut in half 17 times. It's a phenomenon of history. No religion in the world is spread as widely as the Christian faith. Christianity alone has followers in every one of the world's countries. There are at least some Christians in about 11,500 of the world's 12,600 ethno-linguistic people groups. The Christian family speaks 12,500 of the world's 13,500 distinct languages. And we should be surprised at this? I say nay, nay. Why? Because it was exactly what Jesus said he would do. He said, I will build my church, and hell cannot stop me. Or to use the verbiage of our story today, Jesus said, I'll harvest the wheat, and the weeds will not overwhelm the process. On the one hand, while Jesus said that we're salt, providing the world a moral type of preservative against corruption, and Jesus also said we're light, which provides the world a moral example of God's righteousness, Jesus never intimated that the positive influence of the gospel would always be well received or never be unopposed. He simply said the weeds would never overwhelm the wheat. And while evil may seem like it's winning, and I know some of you are discouraged when you look around at all that is wrong, understand something. Evil cannot win. It simply can't. And deep in their hearts, even the non-believing world knows it can't. Because all of us were created in the image of God, and we are generally hardwired with the eventuality that Christ's church will overwhelm the devil's weeds. Why is it that seemingly every time even non-believers write a book or a non-believer crafts a screenplay for a movie, at the end of what they create, good triumphs over evil? You ever wonder why that was? You ever wonder why Darth Vader didn't win? In fact, he was transformed. You wonder why when Spock was killed, he was resurrected? Why when Jason Bourne won all of those battles, his cause was just? Why Prince Charming killed the dragon? You remember the Titans? Exactly. And Jesus left the crowd, verse 36, and he went into his house, or the house, and his disciples came to him and said, explain to us his parable of the weeds in the field. Now, when I read it, and I know I have the benefit, the luxury of history, the church age, the history, the story of the church. But the disciples, they were still in a fog, and they said, explain to us what you're talking about out there. And he said, well, let me explain to you all the different components here. The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it's a throwback to the parable we shared last time. The underdressed wedding attendant, you remember that dude? You know what he was? He was a weed. Verse 43, and then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, if you got ears, would you please raise your hand? Come on. You don't even have to hear with them. If you just got them, you got to raise your hand. All right. Whoever has ears, y'all better listen to this because it's important. We all know what will eventually happen in the last chapter of the human story because our collective conscience has been seared with this reality. Jesus wins. And so here's the third observation. While we remain focused on a worldwide harvest and we expect the church to still thrive in the midst of this growing threat, we should also expect the glory of what is right to outshine and outlast the story of what went wrong. Why did things go wrong in the first place? The question is proposed in this parable. Who planted the weeds? An enemy did this, Jesus said. The devil did this. It's important to remember that Jesus believed in a personal devil. Jesus believed in an evil personality who fights God tooth and nail. Now, only 57% of Americans believe in the devil anymore. Even some of you Christians would say, oh, I believe in Jesus, but I don't believe in the devil. But see, if you believe in Jesus, you automatically have a problem because y'all can't believe in Jesus if you don't believe what he believed in. And he believed in a devil, which means you're stuck with him. If he wasn't right about that, if Jesus was not right about the devil, then everything Jesus ever said is suspect. But I believe Jesus was right about what? Everything, including this. And what has been the devil's MO throughout history, throughout the church age? What has been his methodia, as the Greek word describes the schemes that the Apostle Paul talks about when he writes regarding the spiritual warfare in Ephesians 6? The devil's approach is to look like us, to sound like us, to masquerade as an angel of light, as Paul wrote the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 11, looking and sounding so much like you, so much like me, that we don't even recognize who he really is until later. But time has a way of vetting everybody, including him. And like the unwelcome guest at the wedding feast, it all eventually catches up with him too. And it will catch up with you. See, while you and I are consistently cautioned to not judge people, and the reason you and I are told don't judge is because we're idiots. We don't know. How do we judge? We don't know people's hearts. We don't know their story. We can't put ourselves in their shoes. Jesus knows that. That's why I said don't judge anybody. Everybody loves to talk about how we shouldn't judge, but they fail to respect the fact that he can. And not only he can, but he what? Oh, he will. And why can he judge people? Why did he reserve the right to judge? Because he knows everything. And because Jesus knows everything, nobody gets away with nothing, ultimately. And when Jesus renders a verdict, when Jesus says that one is wheat and that one's a weed, there is no question, there is no argument, there is no appeal. The King has spoken. So let me land this thing. Let me recap, fill in a few blanks. Just want to make sure we get to the right place together. First of all, Jesus came to save the world. Can I just say categorically that's always been his objective? He came to save you and me. He came to save us from ourselves. He came to save us from our problems. He came to save us from Victorville, from Hesperia and Phelan and Apple Valley. For God so loved the world that he sent his son to what? To save us. And that has always been the objective. Never lose sight of the objective. And then there's a strategy. The strategy is that Jesus said he's going to build his church. What we do here on the weekend is strategic. It's not the objective. You don't fulfill your purpose as a Christian by going to church. Oh no, that is not the case. You come because we are here to strategize. How can we help our commander-in-chief? How can we help our king? How can we partner with him to fulfill the objective of this campaign? And then number 3, Jesus partners with you and I as his primary tactic. This is tactical. Relationships is where the battles in life are won and lost. And everybody has been given 8 to 15 of them supernaturally and strategically placed on the front burners of our lives. And it is through those relationships that 95% of the people who are in the body of Christ are in the body of Christ. He partners with you and me. Tactic to secure the harvest. Tactical, strategic, objective. You know what that is? That's military terminology. And you know why we use military terminology? Because this is what? This is war. And number 4, when Jesus finally declares victory, no one will end up on the wrong side of the fire line. Because when Jesus says, whatever Jesus says, like it's done, it's over, and it's true. And number 5, and where I want to land on this, Thanksgiving week is here. Number 5 is very important to me. Don't get discouraged by the weeds. Don't be discouraged by the weeds. Y'all are looking at the weeds. You're looking at all the evil, all the problems. You're looking at what's wrong. You're focused on what's wrong. What did Jesus say? John chapter 4, verse 35. I'm starting to get on my soapbox here. I tell you, open your eyes and look at what? Look at the weeds. Look at the problems. Look at all the obstacles in our lives. Look at the wars that we're fighting, the bitterness, the divisiveness, the rancor, the hatred, the anger. Did Jesus say, look at that? Oh man, you got to look up. Open your eyes. Look at the fields. They are ripe for what? I know life is hard. We live, men and women, I believe this with all my heart, in the greatest generation to reap a harvest for the kingdom of God, because the world has already exposed itself as being incapable of solving our problems. Only Jesus can. And he is the answer. Every question you have, you know what the answer is? Jesus. Every problem you face, you know what the resolution is? Jesus. Now, who's going to tell you that? Are they going to tell you that in Washington, D.C.? Are they going to tell you that in Sacramento? Are they going to tell you anywhere but HDC and all the other places where the gospel is preached? All I'm saying is you gotta keep fighting the good fight. I'm not telling you we're gonna win. I'm telling you we already have won. And you will not, oh my, you're a lively group. You won't see everybody join the harvest, because there are a lot of weeds out there. But we will see many come to faith in Jesus. And notice what Jesus says in that verse. You are looking at it on screen right now. What he says is this: those who are going to come to faith are right now within your range of vision. All you have to do is open your eyes. You don't have to go anywhere. Just open your eyes. You don't have to travel to another country. Just open your eyes. You don't have to even leave your community, your workplace, your school, folks. All you got to do is what? I have taught you this. Open your eyes. When the demonic was healed of his demons, Jesus said, go home to your own people. One of the flagship verses for our whole ministry here at HDC. That phrase right there is the Greek word oikos, referring to those people God has placed in your lap right now. Every day, open your eyes and look at what? The fields. And where are the fields? My goodness, they're your own people. And tell them what? How much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. Okay? So I'm not saying stop watching the news, but man, you got to cut back. That's all I got to say. Father, thank you. Just give us a good week. Help us to be refreshed in the power of your Spirit, knowing what you're doing constantly. Just building your church, not just throughout history, but accelerating even in our generation around the world. People are coming to faith through relationships. And I know that can be our narrative as well. As in the middle of all of this anger, that the light of your grace would shine through. And if we would just open our eyes, oh Lord, help us to see what you see. Lost people who you came to save. Everybody's head bowed, your eyes closed. You might be a lost person. You might be sitting there very uncomfortable today. The whole tension of the message has been because you're feeling more like a weed than you are feeling like wheat. And the Bible's pretty clear about that. You need to admit you're a sinner. Believe Jesus can save you. Choose to place your faith in Jesus. And the reason that you are here today may be because somebody loved you enough to invite you to come. But I will tell you that behind the scenes is a loving God who loved you enough to send his son to die for your sin. And that's got to do something to you. That's got to give you some level of gratitude in responding in an appropriate way by saying, I can admit, I can own my sin, Lord, but I believe that you died to save me, and I choose to place my faith in you right now. Lord, give us a great, thankful, and dynamically powerful week as we represent you during this holiday time in Jesus' great name. All God's children said, amen. All right, God bless you.